Hey guys, tonight we're traveling back in time to a world you probably wouldn't survive in. Picture yourself on the edge of the vast deserts of Central Asia, or standing in the bustling markets of ancient China. The year is around 200 BCE, and the Silk Roads are just beginning to take shape. A network of ancient trade routes that stretches across continents. This sprawling road system connects the Eastern world with the West, transforming civilizations forever. If you were alive back then, it's likely you'd be dealing with harsh travel conditions, bandits, and traders from every corner of the known world. Lucky if you made it to your destination at all. But somehow, these ancient routes thrived, surviving centuries of war, politics, and cultural change. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, drop your location and local time in the comments. Let's see where in the world we're all traveling from tonight. Now, settle in, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The story of the Silk Roads begins in the heart of China, under the Han Dynasty. China had long been a rich, vibrant civilization, but its knowledge of the outside world was limited. In the 2nd century BCE, Emperor Wu of Han sent envoys to Central Asia in search of alliances and trade. These missions resulted in the establishment of the first reliable trade route, extending all the way to the Mediterranean. You can almost picture the scene. Chinese merchants setting off with precious silk, porcelain, and tea, crossing vast deserts and mountains, encountering everything from towering empires to wild nomadic tribes. Historians still debate the exact origins of the Silk Roads, but one thing is clear. It wasn't just about trade. It was about the exchange of culture, ideas, and technology. The first merchants to set off from China were not only carrying silk, but also hopes of opening up a new world, one full of opportunities and dangers. For them, the road was not just a path, it was a lifeline. The early trade was slow, dangerous, and largely unorganized. But over time, it grew into a network of routes that stretched from the ancient capital of Chang'an, modern-day Xi'an, all the way to the Roman Empire. A journey that could take years, depending on the weather, the terrain, and the ever-changing political landscape. Despite all the hardships, the Silk Roads flourished. There was silk to be sold, and not just silk, but spices, gemstones, and more. You might be surprised to know that early traders often used camels to transport their goods. And in return, they brought back goods that were just as valuable, such as horses, glassware, and even ideas from other cultures. One of the most fascinating aspects of the Silk Roads was that while they connected different civilizations, they also allowed for the blending of cultures in ways that the world had never seen before. As you sit there, imagining the ancient caravans trudging along the Silk Roads, let's zoom in on the landscape of the Central Asian steppes, where a lot of this trade started to take root. The year is around 100 BCE, and the nomadic tribes of the region are not just living off the land, but playing a crucial role in the trade between East and West. The Scythians, Saka, and later the Parthians, who were known for their mastery in horse riding and archery, were the first intermediaries between China and the West. They had the skills to navigate the vast, harsh deserts and mountains that most other traders dared not attempt, acting as middlemen in a system of exchange that spanned continents. It's easy to picture them, riding through the endless plains, carrying silk and pottery in one direction, and horses, wool, and exotic goods in the other. Historians still argue whether the nomadic tribes were strictly traders, or if they were more like military mercenaries at times, using their power and control over the region to influence the trade routes. Either way, they were key to the success of the Silk Roads. These tribes controlled crucial stretches of land that linked the major empires of China, Central Asia, Persia, and Rome. You can almost feel the dust in the air as these nomads traded with one another, their horses kicking up clouds as they passed from one oasis to the next. Meanwhile, back in China, Emperor Wu's Han Dynasty had learned the value of these far-flung routes and had begun to make their own investments to secure them. The Han military launched expeditions to expand their borders, pushing their reach all the way into the Taklamakan Desert and beyond, ultimately bringing an influx of new resources, including horses from the Central Asian steppes. This was a time when China was starting to become a major player on the world stage, building alliances and securing its position as a central force in the Silk Road's network. The exchanges that took place on these trade routes weren't just about material wealth. They were also about cultural and technological exchanges. At this point, it's important to pause and think about the kind of goods that were transported along the Silk Roads. You might be thinking of luxury items, silk, tea, and porcelain, but the reality was a little different. Goods like furs, wool, cotton, salt, spices, glassware, and even food staples like rice were in constant demand, and traders worked tirelessly to meet that demand. You can picture them sitting at crossroads, sipping on strong tea and discussing their next moves while sharing stories of the distant lands they'd traveled to. Their faces weathered by the elements, but their eyes bright with the knowledge of the wider world. These traders weren't just crossing geographical borders, they were crossing cultural ones as well, interacting with people who had entirely different ways of life. Historians still debate the exact impact of these cultural exchanges, but we know for certain that the Silk Roads did more than just bring material goods to the empires. They brought new ideas. Buddhism made its way from India into Central Asia and China, a journey that would continue for centuries. Scholars from the East and West began to trade knowledge and philosophy, with Greek, Roman, and Persian ideas intermingling with Chinese innovations. This is the world of the Silk Roads, not just a series of trade routes, but the veins through which cultures, religions, and knowledge flowed. As we continue down the dusty, windswept paths of the Silk Roads, let's shift our focus to the ancient city of Alexandria, Egypt, in the 1st century CE. Alexandria was, in many ways, the Mediterranean's gateway to the East. It was here, at the mouth of the Nile, where East met West in a great confluence of cultures, ideas, and goods. Traders from all over the world, India, Persia, Arabia, and the Roman Empire, flocked to Alexandria to exchange their wares. Its bustling harbor, lined with towering statues and lighthouses, was the hub of a trade network that spread across Europe, Africa, and Asia. At this point, you're almost certain to hear the faint sounds of ancient merchants haggling over the price of spices, silk, and exotic animals. Perhaps a rhinoceros or a pair of lions from the depths of Africa. The Egyptians, known for their intricate trade networks, brought along goods like papyrus, grain, and perfumes, all of which were highly sought after by the Romans, Greeks, and others. Alexandria wasn't just a trade city, it was a beacon of learning and culture too. The famous Library of Alexandria, with its vast collection of scrolls, attracted scholars from all over the ancient world. Imagine stepping into that grand building, surrounded by the smell of ink and the sound of quills scratching on papyrus. The exchange of knowledge here was just as important as the exchange of goods, with ideas flowing as freely as the trade routes. Historians still argue about how much influence Alexandria's intellectual hub had on the trade routes. But one thing is certain. This city became a center of cultural exchange that influenced not just Egypt, but the entire Mediterranean world. The blending of Egyptian, Greek, and Persian ideas in Alexandria helped pave the way for the eventual spread of knowledge along the Silk Roads. This, in turn, affected everything from architecture to science, mathematics, and astronomy. The bustling markets of Alexandria were, in essence, a microcosm of the Silk Roads, a place where trade wasn't just about acquiring things, but about sharing ideas and experiences. As we continue our journey, imagine the Roman Empire's vast reach across the Mediterranean, stretching from the windswept coasts of Iberia to the lush hills of North Africa, and from the snowy mountains of Germania to the golden sands of Egypt. The Romans, perhaps more than any other civilization, understood the importance of securing trade routes. They worked tirelessly to maintain control over key areas like the Levant, Egypt, and parts of Persia. The Roman Empire's extensive network of roads, many of which were built with remarkable precision, connected cities from one side of the empire to the other. These roads, much like the Silk Roads, allowed for the rapid movement of goods, soldiers, and information. Historians still debate how much the Roman Empire directly benefited from the Silk Roads, as they were not always in direct control of the eastern regions. However, Roman merchants and traders had access to goods that could only be obtained through these routes. Roman soldiers, too, brought back spoils from the east, luxuries like silks, perfumes, and exotic spices that were highly prized by Roman elites. But it wasn't just about wealth. The Roman Empire's fascination with the East also drove cultural exchange, with Roman soldiers and settlers adopting Eastern customs, clothing, and ideas. It's easy to imagine Roman nobles in their grand villas, sipping on Persian wine while contemplating the latest ideas from the East. The Romans were not the only empire to influence the Silk Roads, of course. The Parthian Empire, stretching across the Iranian plateau, controlled vital sections of the trade routes between the East and the West. The Parthians' unique position made them key players in this great network of trade and culture. They acted as intermediaries, helping facilitate trade between China, India, and the Roman Empire. The Parthians' knowledge of horse riding and military tactics, paired with their political acumen, allowed them to maintain control over vital trade routes, ensuring that their empire flourished through the exchange of goods and culture. Let's now focus on the other side of the world, the East. Imagine walking through the bustling markets of Chang'an, present-day Xi'an, China, around the 2nd century BCE. You've just arrived from the distant lands of the Roman Empire, and as you step off the dusty road, you're greeted by the vibrant colors of the marketplace. The air is thick with the scent of incense, and you can hear the cacophony of traders shouting their wares in a dozen different languages. Traders from Central Asia, India, and the steppes have brought along exotic spices, precious stones, and brightly colored fabrics that sparkle in the sunlight. In the distance, you spot a caravan of camels, laden with silk, a precious commodity that the West can only dream of obtaining. Chang'an, the capital of the Han Dynasty, was the heart of China's political and economic power. But it was also the anchor of the Silk Roads in the East. This city, with its grand walls and palaces, was not just a political center, but a cultural and commercial one as well. At the time, the Han Dynasty was at the height of its power, stretching far beyond the Great Wall, all the way into the western regions of Central Asia. The Han rulers knew the value of trade, and they worked tirelessly to open up the Silk Roads by establishing a series of alliances with Central Asian kingdoms. This allowed them to access the rich goods of the West, while also sending out their own treasures, like silk, lacquer, and tea. Historians still debate the initial spark that led to China's first official opening of the Silk Roads under the Han Dynasty. Some suggest it was a desire for military alliances and economic strength, while others believe it was the result of the expansionist policies of Emperor Wu, who sent his emissary, Zhang Qian, on a diplomatic mission to Central Asia. Regardless of the specifics, the Han Dynasty's expansion along the Silk Road set the stage for a centuries-long period of cultural exchange between East and West. And it was here that the famous trade of silk began to take off. The silk itself is an essential part of this story. It was one of China's greatest exports and highly coveted in the Roman world, where it was seen as a symbol of luxury. To the Chinese, silk represented not just wealth, but cultural identity, as they had perfected its production long before anyone else. The process of making silk was closely guarded by the Chinese, and it remained a state secret for centuries. Imagine the surprise of a Roman merchant when, after traveling across mountains and deserts, he finally touched a bolt of fine silk, a luxury he had only heard rumors about. The Roman elite, especially the emperors, were willing to pay outrageous sums for the fine fabrics from the East. It wasn't just the rich who desired silk, though. Traders from India, Persia, and the Arabian Peninsula also wanted a piece of the pie. As silk became increasingly available, it started to weave its way into the fabric of global trade, shaping the economy of the ancient world. Historians still argue whether the vast trade in silk was the driving force behind the establishment of the Silk Roads, or if it was simply one of the many luxury goods that helped fuel the exchange. Some even argue that the desire for silk helped create the great empires along the trade route, while others suggest it was just one part of a larger web of goods and ideas that flowed between East and West. But the Silk Roads were more than just a conduit for goods. They were also a vehicle for cultural and intellectual exchange. In China, Buddhism had begun to take root, and by the 2nd century BCE, Buddhist monks and scholars were traveling along the trade routes, spreading their teachings. This exchange of religious ideas was a significant aspect of the Silk Road's cultural impact, as Buddhism would eventually spread from India through Central Asia and China, and even reach the Roman Empire. The presence of Buddhist art and scriptures in China signaled a deepening connection between East and West, far beyond the exchange of material goods. Fast forward to the 1st century CE. You are now standing at the crossroads of the Silk Roads, alongside the great desert caravans of Central Asia. The harsh, dry winds of the Taklamakan Desert whip at your face as you wait in the shade of a nearby oasis. The air is filled with the scent of camels, spices, and the occasional waft of firewood burning over a low flame. Here, the old trade routes from the east and west converge, and you are about to witness the flow of goods that will cross vast stretches of land and sea. From here, merchants from all corners of the ancient world will transport their prized commodities: silk from China, glassware and wine from Rome, spices and precious stones from India, and horses from Central Asia. At this crossroads, the real magic of the Silk Roads happens. The harsh desert serves as both a barrier and a unifying force, forcing travelers to rely on each other for survival. And in the process, they exchange not just goods, but knowledge, ideas, and culture. These desert roads were the lifeblood of the Silk Roads, linking the west to the east through the formidable mountainous landscapes of Central Asia. As you follow the caravan through the desert, you begin to see the intricate networks of trading posts and oasis towns that dotted the landscape. These outposts were not just places to rest, but vibrant cultural hubs, where travelers from different parts of the world mingled, traded goods, and shared stories. The Silk Roads, with their vast network of connected peoples, were the conduits for a staggering amount of commerce. Horsemen from the steppes would trade horses, sheep, and furs, while merchants from India and Persia would bring in rare spices, ivory, and textiles. In return, the Chinese would offer their silk, paper, and porcelain, as well as their unrivaled knowledge of gunpowder and printing. Historians still argue whether the Silk Roads were driven primarily by luxury goods or whether it was the necessity of survival. Spices, medicines, and essential goods that prompted the early spread of trade. Many believe that the initial exchange was centered around luxury, with silk, jade, and spices being the most sought-after items, while others argue that more practical goods, like grains, livestock, and medicinal herbs were the true drivers of the trade. However, one thing is certain. The demand for these exotic goods created the foundation for trade routes that would persist for centuries, contributing to the prosperity of empires and civilizations along the way. As you watch the merchant caravan slowly wind its way through the desert, you reflect on how the trade of these luxury goods has shaped the political landscape of the ancient world. The Roman Empire, for example, grew increasingly dependent on the wealth generated from Silk Road trade, and it is said that by the 2nd century CE, the Romans were importing so much silk that it became a symbol of luxury and wealth in Rome. At the same time, in China, silk became a powerful political tool for the Han Dynasty, with the emperor using it as a form of tribute to foreign rulers. This led to the creation of diplomatic and trade alliances, and soon, the emperors of China were sending envoys across Central Asia, cementing their influence over the vast region. One of the most interesting and little-known aspects of the Silk Roads is the role of women in trade. Women were not only the recipients of luxury goods like silk, but they were also involved in the trade itself, especially in areas such as textile production, pottery, and the cultivation of crops like cotton and rice. Women played a pivotal role in the economies of the Silk Roads, particularly in Central Asia, where they were responsible for the creation of many of the fabrics and goods that would be traded along the route. This fact remains an underappreciated aspect of the Silk Roads, as most historical accounts focus on the political and military power of the great empires involved, overlooking the influence of women in shaping the trade. The role of Central Asia in this exchange is often overlooked as well, yet it was vital to the functioning of the Silk Roads. The region was home to the nomadic peoples, whose expertise in horsemanship and warfare made them key players in facilitating trade. The nomads of the steppes, with their vast herds of horses, would help guard the trade routes, acting as intermediaries between the East and West. In this sense, the steppes were the lifeblood of the Silk Roads. Without them, the flow of goods and ideas would have been much more difficult. The exchange of cultures along the Silk Roads also gave birth to a variety of artistic styles and influences that still echo through history. As you continue on your journey through the desert, you encounter a caravan of traders from India, who bring with them beautiful sculptures and intricate paintings depicting scenes from Hindu mythology. These artworks, along with the Buddhist and Persian influences that also traveled along the roads, would eventually reach China and Rome, merging with local traditions and creating new forms of art. This blending of styles and ideas helped shape the aesthetic landscape of the ancient world, creating a rich tapestry of artistic expression that transcended cultural boundaries. Historians continue to debate the extent to which the Silk Roads facilitated cultural exchange. Some argue that the spread of Buddhism and other religions along the trade routes was one of the most significant outcomes of the trade, while others suggest that the true cultural exchange came in the form of art, architecture, and intellectual ideas. Regardless of the specifics, what is clear is that the Silk Roads were more than just a trade route. They were a melting pot of cultures, a bridge between East and West that allowed ideas, traditions, and innovations to spread across vast distances. The year is now 4th century CE, and the Silk Roads have reached their peak. The once vast networks of caravanserais, bustling with the sound of merchants haggling and the clinking of coins, are now teeming with travelers from all over the world. The wind carries the salty air of the Mediterranean as you find yourself standing in the vibrant marketplace of Constantinople, the great city at the crossroads of Europe and Asia. It is a meeting point of civilizations. Romans, Persians, Indians, and even Chinese merchants, each with their own treasures to trade. The marketplace smells of incense and exotic spices, and there's a constant flow of movement as goods are exchanged. As you watch, you can't help but notice the incredible diversity of goods on display. The silks from China, with their vibrant colors and intricate patterns, seem to shine in the sunlight, while the amber and furs from the Baltic region catch the eye. Fine Persian carpets are unfurled on the ground, their rich colors and detailed designs telling stories of distant lands. The Romans, now at the height of their empire, have brought their expertise in metalwork, while Indian merchants proudly display their aromatic spices and gemstones. Here in Constantinople, the city of the emperors, the Silk Roads have fused into a complex web of connections, from the Byzantine Empire to the Sassanid Persians and beyond. Constantinople, once called Byzantium, has become a thriving hub of trade, culture, and politics. It's a city that understands the importance of commerce, and its location on the Bosphorus Strait has made it the ideal gateway for trade between East and West. Traders come and go with their goods, carrying not only merchandise, but also the exchange of ideas, philosophies, and religion. But the political landscape is shifting. The Roman Empire, which once stood as the unrivaled power of the Mediterranean, is beginning to fracture. The division of the empire into the eastern and western halves in the late 3rd century has laid the groundwork for the eventual rise of the Byzantine Empire in the east. It is in this context that the Silk Roads are facing a new chapter, one shaped by the spread of Christianity, the rise of Islam, and the increasing dominance of the Islamic caliphates. As you walk the streets of Constantinople, you realize that the world of trade, politics, and religion, is about to change in profound ways. As the 7th century approaches, the Silk Roads are beginning to shift their focus. The rise of Islam, which began in the Arabian Peninsula, has already started to affect trade in the region. The Umayyad Caliphate, followed by the Abbasid Caliphate, has begun to expand its reach, sweeping across the Middle East and into Central Asia. Islam, with its focus on trade and cultural exchange, has become a powerful force in shaping the Silk Roads. The caliphates have not only helped facilitate the movement of goods, but they have also encouraged the exchange of knowledge, especially in the fields of science, mathematics, and medicine. Scholars from all over the world are coming to cities like Baghdad, Damascus, and Cairo to share ideas and learn from each other. It is also during this time that the Central Asian nomads, the Turkic and Mongol peoples, began to assert their power over the Silk Roads. With their vast herds of horses and unparalleled skills in warfare, they become the masters of the steppe. The expansion of the Mongol Empire, under the leadership of Genghis Khan in the 13th century, will bring both destruction and opportunity. The Mongols, despite their reputation for violence, will also help open up vast areas of the Silk Roads for trade. They are the ones who unite the fragmented empires of Central Asia and China, ensuring that the flow of goods from east to west is uninterrupted. Historians still debate the exact role the Mongols played in the flourishing of the Silk Roads. Some argue that the Mongols' military campaigns were primarily responsible for reopening trade routes that had been disrupted by centuries of instability, while others suggest that the Mongol Empire, with its complex political structure, helped create an environment of relative peace, allowing trade to flourish. Either way, the Mongols played a key role in the revitalization of the Silk Roads, allowing goods, people, and ideas to flow freely across Eurasia. The expansion of the Islamic world and the Mongol conquests also brought new cultural and religious influences to the Silk Roads. The spread of Islam along the trade routes led to the development of new architectural styles, from the mosques of Baghdad to the minarets of Samarkand. The influence of Persian and Indian art can be seen in the intricate tilework and the use of geometric patterns that decorated the buildings along the Silk Roads. Even the spread of the Arabic script, which began to replace older writing systems in parts of Central Asia, helped unify the diverse peoples along the route. The exchange of ideas was not limited to religion and art. The Silk Roads were instrumental in spreading knowledge, especially in the fields of astronomy, medicine, and mathematics. The famous House of Wisdom in Baghdad, established during the Abbasid Caliphate, became a center for scientific and intellectual exchange. Scholars from India, China, Greece, and Persia gathered here to translate important texts, including works by Aristotle, Galen, and Ptolemy, and to expand upon them. The works of Muslim scholars in fields such as algebra, chemistry, and optics would go on to influence both the Islamic world and later European Renaissance thinkers. You can almost hear the conversations taking place in the bustling marketplaces, where merchants are not only bartering for silk, spices, and precious metals, but also exchanging ideas about the stars, the nature of disease, and the philosophies of the ancients. The Silk Roads are no longer just a path for trade. They have become a conduit for knowledge, science, and culture, shaping the development of civilizations along the way. The 13th century dawns, and with it, a new chapter in the story of the Silk Roads. The Mongols, under Genghis Khan, have created an empire that stretches from the Pacific Ocean to the Caspian Sea, uniting vast regions of Central Asia, China, and the Middle East. The once fragmented Silk Roads are now under the control of a single ruler, who has effectively eliminated many of the barriers to trade that had existed for centuries. For the first time in history, merchants and travelers can travel from Europe to China with relative ease, without fearing bandits or warring kingdoms. As you stand at the edge of the Silk Roads network in the city of Samarkand, it's impossible to ignore the incredible energy of this moment in history. Samarkand, located at the crossroads of Asia, has become a center of commerce, culture, and learning. The streets are lined with merchants from all over the known world, each offering exotic goods from their distant lands. The city's architecture reflects the wealth and grandeur of the region, with its grand mosques, minarets, and caravans. In this new Mongol Empire, the Silk Roads are not just a means of trading goods. They are a lifeline for the exchange of ideas. The Mongols have a unique policy toward trade. They understand its value not just for economic prosperity, but for the flow of knowledge. The Mongol rulers, particularly Genghis Khan's grandson, Kublai Khan, are patrons of learning, welcoming scholars from all corners of the empire to come and share their knowledge. The famous Persian scholar and polymath, Nasir al-Din al-Tusi, works alongside Chinese and Indian scholars to create some of the most advanced astronomical charts and mathematical models of the time. Historians still argue about how much the Mongols truly understood the importance of intellectual exchange. Some believe that the Mongols, despite their violent conquests, actively sought to support scholars and foster trade in a way that no other empire had before them. Others argue that the Mongols were more focused on expanding their empire through military conquest, and used intellectual exchange as a way to strengthen their rule. Whatever the case may be, the Silk Roads, under Mongol rule, are flourishing like never before. The Mongols' expansion also had a profound impact on the way goods were traded along the Silk Roads. With their control over the entire length of the route, they established a system of trade caravans that moved goods safely and efficiently across the empire. The Mongols' protection allowed for the free flow of goods such as silk, spices, precious metals, and even slaves, from one end of the Silk Roads to the other. Cities like Samarkand, Bukhara, and Tabriz are thriving, filled with traders, artisans, and scholars. The Silk Roads are once again the beating heart of global trade. But with the Mongol Empire's vast control came its inevitable fragmentation. After Genghis Khan's death in 1227, the empire was divided among his sons and grandsons. The once unified Silk Roads began to fragment again, as different Mongol rulers carved out their own territories. The Yuan dynasty in China, led by Kublai Khan, continued to dominate the eastern end of the Silk Roads, while the Ilkhanate in Persia controlled the western end. The lack of unity in the Mongol Empire led to political instability, and the flow of goods and ideas was once again disrupted. You can feel the tension in the air as you watch merchants nervously preparing to depart. Despite the peace and prosperity brought by the Mongols, the instability of the fractured empire has begun to take its toll on the Silk Roads. With the fall of the Mongol Empire in the late 14th century, trade along the Silk Roads begins to slow. The Black Death, which swept across Europe and Asia in the mid-14th century, further disrupts the delicate balance of trade. Whole regions, once thriving with merchants, are now empty. Their markets abandoned, their roads no longer traveled. Yet, the influence of the Silk Roads is far from over. Despite the collapse of the Mongol Empire and the political instability that follows, the cultural and intellectual exchange that took place during this period continues to reverberate through history. Ideas, technologies, and cultural practices that were once shared across the Silk Roads would go on to shape the course of civilizations for centuries to come. The introduction of paper-making techniques from China to the West, the spread of Islam and its scientific advancements, and the exchange of agricultural products like rice and cotton would all leave their mark on the world. Historians still debate the ultimate impact of the Mongols on the Silk Roads. Some view the Mongol Empire as the zenith of Silk Road trade, a period of unprecedented cultural and economic exchange. Others argue that the Mongols' impact was more destructive, as their military campaigns brought destruction to many of the cities and regions that once thrived along the route. The truth likely lies somewhere in between. The Mongols, for all their conquest and violence, did open up new possibilities for trade and intellectual exchange. And the legacy of the Silk Roads would continue to influence the world long after their empire crumbled. By the late 14th century, with the fragmentation of the Mongol Empire and the arrival of the Black Death, the once thriving Silk Roads have started to show signs of decay. The global system that had connected the East with the West is no longer as robust as it once was. Yet, just as the ancient trade routes seem to falter, a new player begins to rise, a player who will help reinvigorate the Silk Roads: the Ottoman Empire. The Ottomans, emerging from the ruins of the Byzantine Empire, steadily expand across the eastern Mediterranean, gaining control over key trading cities. Their rise, fueled by their conquest of Constantinople in 1453, signifies a new chapter for trade between Europe, Africa, and Asia. The Ottomans' strategic position between the two great continents, their dominant navy, and their well-organized bureaucracy bring an era of stability and renewal to the long-distance trade routes that connect the Silk Roads. As you stand in the bustling market square of Istanbul, formerly Constantinople, the energy is palpable. The city has become a melting pot of cultures, with traders and artisans from all over the world converging in this once imperial capital. On every corner, merchants sell spices, textiles, and precious metals from the East, alongside European glass, pottery, and weapons. The Ottomans have effectively revived the system of caravanserais, rest stops for traders and travelers, and their large merchant fleet dominates the Mediterranean, facilitating trade between Asia, the Middle East, and Europe. The Silk Roads, however, have changed significantly under Ottoman control. No longer the sole lifeline for trade, they now serve as one of many interconnected trade routes. The Ottomans play a critical role in facilitating trade between the West and East, but the paths are no longer as wide open as they were during the height of the Mongol Empire. Now, goods are funneled through Ottoman-controlled cities and ports, primarily Istanbul, where they are exchanged for European luxuries such as textiles, wine, and metalwork. Historians still debate the extent to which the Ottomans revived the Silk Roads. While the empire provided vital control over the trade routes and served as a mediator between East and West, the growth of maritime trade routes beginning in the late 15th century began to diminish the importance of the overland paths. The opening of sea routes around Africa and the Americas by the Portuguese and Spanish meant that goods once carried by camel caravans now sailed directly to European shores. Yet, for a time, the Ottomans were the bridge between two worlds, facilitating the exchange of not just goods, but also ideas, technologies, and cultural practices. As you watch the bustling markets of Istanbul, there's a sense of melancholy, as well as hope. The Silk Roads are far from their former glory, but they're still alive in a new form, taking on a more fragmented nature in the face of the rise of sea trade. The Ottomans are not just controlling land routes. They are helping to lay the foundation for a global trading network that, in time, will connect the world in ways the ancient Silk Roads never could have imagined. Historians also argue about whether the Ottomans' role in the Silk Roads was ultimately beneficial or detrimental. Some argue that their political dominance over the routes helped to foster a new wave of trade and cultural exchange between Europe and Asia, revitalizing what had seemed like a dying system. Others suggest that the Ottomans' centralized control stifled the fluid, diverse trade networks that had existed under the Mongols, narrowing the scope of the Silk Roads to a single corridor of Ottoman-controlled land. Either way, the Ottomans left their mark on the Silk Roads, just as the Mongols did centuries earlier. Despite their dominance, the Ottomans were not immune to the changing winds of history. By the 17th century, European nations such as the Dutch, Portuguese, and eventually the British and French had established global sea routes that bypassed Ottoman control altogether. The Silk Roads, once the crux of world trade, had become less relevant as the world embraced new methods of long-distance commerce, and Europe sought to build its empire across the seas rather than over land. As the 16th century progresses, the rise of maritime powers begins to overshadow the once proud Silk Roads. European nations, armed with superior navigation technology, begin charting new routes that bypass the traditional overland paths that had linked east and west for centuries. The Portuguese, with their mastery of the sea, lead the charge, opening up new trade routes around the southern tip of Africa to reach India and the Far East. This shift marks the beginning of the Age of Exploration, a period when the old Silk Roads, once the lifeblood of trade, fade into the background as new maritime routes take center stage. Yet, as you stand on the bustling docks of Lisbon in the mid-1500s, you see firsthand the remnants of the Silk Road's influence. The port is alive with ships coming from distant lands, Africa, India, and even the Spice Islands, bringing exotic goods like pepper, cinnamon, and silk. The Portuguese crown, flush with wealth from these new sea routes, controls a vast trading empire that stretches across the oceans. But there's still a sense that the world is changing in a way that no one could have predicted a century before. Despite the decline of the Silk Roads, their legacy is far from gone. As European ships make their way to Asia, they bring back not only goods, but also ideas, philosophies, and technologies. The printing press, the knowledge of astronomy, and even the concept of trade as a tool for cultural exchange are all part of this new wave of global connectivity. Yet, with these changes come new challenges. The once thriving trade cities along the old Silk Roads, such as Samarkand and Baghdad, now sit on the periphery of a world that's increasingly shaped by European imperial ambitions. Historians debate the true impact of these new maritime routes on the old Silk Roads. Some argue that the discovery of new sea paths fundamentally transformed global trade, making the overland routes obsolete. Others suggest that the Silk Roads never truly disappeared, but evolved into something more complex and diverse. The exchange of goods across the oceans was intertwined with the continuing flow of ideas, cultures, and even goods along the ancient trade routes, albeit in a much more fragmented and regional form. By the 17th century, the Silk Roads were no longer the central arteries of commerce, but they still played a role in the broader global network. As you continue your journey across the Mediterranean world, the reality of this transformation becomes clear. The grand cities of the Middle East, once the crossroads of the world, are now isolated, relegated to secondary roles in the new global economy. The Ottomans, once masters of the land routes, find themselves in a precarious position. As the European empires expand their reach across the oceans, the Silk Roads are no longer the dominating force they once were, but their legacy is still felt in the cultural exchanges, the fusion of traditions, and the exchange of ideas that continue to ripple through the world. But in this quiet moment, you also understand that while the Silk Roads may no longer dominate the global stage, their influence is far from gone. They have evolved, like the world around them, into something different. Something that will continue to shape the future of trade and culture for centuries to come. Historians still argue whether the decline of the Silk Roads was inevitable given the rise of maritime trade, or whether the overland routes could have continued to thrive if they had received more attention from the powers of the day. The shifting tides of history, it seems, will always be marked by the rise and fall of trade routes, each new phase a reflection of the political, economic, and technological advances of the time. The end of the old Silk Roads was not the end of trade. It was simply the beginning of a new chapter in the interconnected history of the world. As you move into the 18th century, a quiet but significant transformation begins to take place. The Silk Roads may no longer be the world's dominant trade route, but the legacy of this ancient network of paths continues to manifest in unexpected ways. The land-based routes, though overshadowed by the sea routes, still serve as important channels for trade between Central Asia and China. In the heart of this change stands the Qing dynasty in China, a mighty empire that still feels the echoes of the ancient trade routes. The Silk Road may be in decline, but it has left a lasting imprint on China, particularly in the cultural exchanges and the richness of its silk, porcelain, and tea trade. You walk through the markets of Beijing, where exotic goods from Central Asia and beyond are displayed in vibrant stalls. The influence of the Silk Road is unmistakable in the city's architecture, art, and the way people dress. The Chinese merchants still have a steady hand in controlling the movement of goods across Asia, though now they are interacting with European powers rather than the old caravans of Central Asia. Tea, for example, is still one of the most sought-after commodities, but it's now exchanged for silver and other European goods that arrive via sea routes from the west. The Qing rulers are keenly aware of the importance of maintaining control over these land routes, but their focus is increasingly on preserving the internal stability of their vast empire. The overland Silk Roads, while still vital for regional trade, are no longer the grand conduits of cultural and economic exchange they once were. Yet, it's fascinating how the old routes persist in shaping not only the flow of goods, but also the interactions between distant cultures. The same principles of connectivity that defined the Silk Road centuries ago are still in play, albeit in a much more fragmented and regional manner. As the European powers continue to expand, China faces challenges on multiple fronts. The Industrial Revolution, gaining momentum in the West, is fundamentally changing the world. European empires are beginning to establish their dominance in Asia, and the old trade routes are being overtaken by the steam-powered ships and railroads of the 19th century. The Opium Wars between China and Britain are a painful reminder of how far the world has shifted. The Silk Roads, which once connected the East to the West in peaceful trade, are now a distant memory, overshadowed by imperial ambitions and the relentless march of modernity. Historians still argue whether the decline of the Silk Roads was truly inevitable in the face of European dominance, or whether the routes could have evolved differently if the empires of the East had been able to maintain their sovereignty and technological advancement. The Qing dynasty's focus on internal governance while protecting their traditions meant that they were ill-prepared for the rapid technological advancements that were transforming the world. The Silk Roads, once a symbol of cultural and economic harmony, now face a new age of global imperialism, where the old exchanges are fractured and overshadowed by new forms of power and control. Even so, as you stand in the bustling markets of Beijing, there's a quiet resilience that lingers in the air. The Silk Roads may have transformed, but their legacy is alive and well, embedded in the art, the culture, and the people you encounter. The goods and ideas that flowed along these ancient routes continue to reverberate, shaping the world in ways that no one could have predicted. The end of the old Silk Roads did not mean the end of global connectivity. Instead, it marked the beginning of a new chapter in the story of trade and cultural exchange. As the world moved into the modern era, the spirit of the Silk Roads, of trade, communication, and the exchange of ideas, remained a cornerstone of human progress, albeit in a new, rapidly changing context. The 19th century arrives, and with it comes a new phase in the story of global trade. The old Silk Roads, though no longer the arteries of international commerce, have not been completely forgotten. While the rise of sea routes and imperial control by European powers dominates much of the trade landscape, there is still a pulse, faint but persistent, along the ancient paths. You find yourself in Central Asia, standing in the remnants of the ancient trade cities that once flourished along the Silk Roads. Cities like Samarkand and Bukhara, once thriving centers of culture and commerce, now bear the marks of time, though they still stand as testament to a rich past. The 19th century sees an influx of new technology, especially the steam engine, which revolutionizes travel and trade. The old caravans that once crisscrossed the arid deserts are replaced by railroads and steamships, opening new avenues for global trade. The steppes of Central Asia, once traversed by camel caravans carrying silk and spices, now see the iron rails of the Russian Empire stretching across them, facilitating a different kind of exchange. The Russian Empire, expanding rapidly eastward, plays a key role in reconfiguring the landscape of the Silk Roads. While these new routes are not the same as the ancient trade routes, they are still rooted in the geographical and cultural spaces that the Silk Roads once connected. You watch as the trains chug along the tracks, carrying goods from far-off places. The once quiet and remote steppe is now buzzing with the hum of industrial progress, as railroads connect the vast expanse of Russia to the heart of Central Asia. Yet, the echoes of the past are still here. In the markets of these ancient cities, you can see the old goods, the textiles, the ceramics, the spices, that once crossed the great trade routes. They are still valued, still exchanged, though they now compete with European goods flooding the region. This era also marks the beginning of the Great Game, a geopolitical struggle between the British and Russian empires for control over Central Asia. The British, having already established their dominance in India, look to expand their influence into the heart of Asia, while the Russians push southward. The traditional Silk Roads, which once saw the peaceful exchange of goods and ideas, are now battlegrounds for political power. The legacy of the Silk Roads, which fostered cultural exchange and mutual benefit, is now complicated by imperial ambitions and territorial disputes. Historians still debate the extent to which the old Silk Road's legacy influenced the geopolitical conflicts of this era. Was the Great Game truly a continuation of the Silk Road's legacy of East-West interactions? Or was it a departure into a more militaristic and imperialistic age? Some argue that the strategic importance of Central Asia, with its ancient trade routes and access to valuable resources, played a crucial role in shaping the rivalries of the 19th century. Others suggest that the decline of the Silk Roads as a trade route meant that the region's significance was no longer cultural but purely strategic in the eyes of the European powers. As the 19th century marches on, the decline of the old Silk Roads becomes more evident. The flow of goods along these paths continues, but it is now diminished in comparison to the booming maritime trade routes. The innovations of the modern world, steamships, telegraphs, and railroads, reshape the map of commerce and communication, shifting the focus away from the land-based Silk Roads. The trade routes are now more fragmented, controlled by competing empires, and the vibrant exchanges of the past are overshadowed by the demands of empire building and industrialization. Even so, there is a certain nostalgia that lingers in the air. In the far corners of the Silk Roads, people still tell stories of the great caravans, the merchants who brought exotic goods from far-off lands, and the cultural exchanges that once took place. The old routes, while no longer as vital as they once were, still hold a place in the imagination of those who remember the time when the world seemed a little smaller, when connections were made across deserts and mountains, and when cultures mingled freely along the paths of commerce. In the face of imperial ambition and industrial growth, the legacy of the Silk Roads continues to echo, a reminder of a time when trade, culture, and human connections flowed across the vast expanse of Eurasia. Though the land-based routes may no longer be the dominant force in global trade, their history still shapes the way people think about the exchange of goods, ideas, and cultures. As the 20th century dawns, the world is dramatically transformed by industrialization, globalization, and war. The Silk Roads, long relegated to history, become something of a distant memory, a romanticized past that few can truly grasp. However, in the midst of the rapid changes sweeping the globe, you begin to see a subtle yet undeniable resurgence of interest in the ancient routes. A new generation of historians, travelers, and adventurers seeks to reconnect with the past, to understand how the old Silk Roads shaped the modern world. By the early 1900s, as the empires of Europe and Asia are increasingly interconnected, the global exchange of ideas and goods begins to look more like the ancient Silk Roads than ever before, though the context has shifted. In this new era, you notice the rapid growth of global cities, connected by railroads, highways, and, most significantly, air routes. The ancient cities that once thrived along the Silk Roads, Samarkand, Bukhara, Xi'an, are now relics of an older age. Yet the continued trade in goods and ideas, particularly between East and West, draws a subtle, invisible line from those ancient trade routes to the present. The establishment of global institutions like the United Nations, the World Bank, and the World Trade Organization in the mid-20th century further complicates the legacy of the Silk Roads. These modern organizations, born out of the aftermath of two world wars, embody the same spirit of cross-cultural exchange and cooperation that defined the Silk Roads in ancient times, though their scope and power are far greater. The idea of a Silk Road in the modern sense becomes increasingly associated with global trade, diplomacy, and the flow of capital, people, and information. Yet, even as globalization seems to be reaching new heights, historians still argue whether the Silk Roads were truly global in their scope. Some scholars assert that while the Silk Roads allowed for significant exchanges of goods and cultures between East and West, they never achieved the truly interconnected world that we live in today. Others argue that the roots of our modern globalized world can indeed be traced back to the ancient trade networks of the Silk Roads, as they laid the foundation for the flow of goods, people, and ideas across vast distances. The 20th century also brings with it a renewed interest in the ancient cultural exchanges that took place along the Silk Roads. From the spreading of Buddhism from India to China to the transfer of technology and knowledge across borders, the movement of ideas is often just as significant as the trade in tangible goods. The impact of these exchanges on art, religion, and science cannot be overstated. One of the most lasting legacies of the Silk Roads is the profound and lasting cultural exchange between East and West, which would continue to shape the modern world in unexpected ways. For instance, in the 20th century, when China began to open up to the outside world in the 1970s, the fascination with the ancient Silk Roads surged once again. As China sought to modernize and become a global power, it looked to its ancient history as a source of inspiration. The renewed interest in the Silk Roads has even led to the development of new trade routes, such as China's Belt and Road Initiative, which echoes the spirit of the ancient routes in its aim to connect China with countries across Asia, Europe, and Africa. The Belt and Road Initiative, launched in 2013, can be seen as the 21st century reincarnation of the Silk Roads, albeit in a new geopolitical context. Just as the ancient Silk Roads connected the distant corners of Eurasia, the Belt and Road Initiative seeks to establish trade routes that span the globe, connecting China to regions across the world. This modern version of the Silk Roads is a reflection of China's growing influence in the world economy, and it speaks to the continuing relevance of the Silk Road's legacy in the context of globalization. Historians still debate whether this new initiative is truly a revival of the Silk Roads or simply a product of modern geopolitics. Some argue that the ancient Silk Roads were about more than just trade. They were about cultural exchange, human connections, and the flow of knowledge and ideas across borders. In contrast, the Belt and Road Initiative, while focused on infrastructure and trade, has been seen by some as a way for China to exert political and economic influence over other nations. The role of the Silk Roads in shaping global history is complex, and the motivations behind their modern counterparts are as multifaceted as ever. Despite the complexities of modern geopolitics, the true significance of the Silk Roads lies in the cultural exchanges that occurred along these ancient trade routes. The stories of travelers, merchants, and scholars who traversed these paths and interacted with people from different cultures are essential to understanding how the world has evolved into the globalized society we know today. As you reflect on this, you realize that the spirit of the Silk Roads, of curiosity, exploration, and mutual benefit, still lives on in the connections we make with one another, whether through trade, diplomacy, or cultural exchange. The 21st century finds the legacy of the ancient Silk Roads more relevant than ever. You can feel it as you travel through the vast, interconnected world that stretches across continents. Cities that were once just dots on a map, Samarkand, Xi'an, and Istanbul, are now thriving centers of commerce, culture, and tourism. It's almost as if the Silk Roads have been resurrected, not in their ancient form, but in the way modern trade routes and digital connectivity have transformed the way we interact with one another. The invisible threads that once carried silk, spices, and precious goods now transmit data, ideas, and capital with the same speed and impact. In the 21st century, the Silk Roads have shifted from being a physical network of land and sea routes to a broader concept that represents the increasing global interconnectedness. The rise of technology, particularly the internet, has been a key driver of this transformation. Just as ancient traders relied on the interconnectedness of the Silk Roads to exchange goods, modern businesses rely on digital networks to exchange information, services, and capital. It's clear that the same principles of cross-cultural exchange that defined the Silk Roads still underlie the flow of information today. The world may be more interconnected than ever, but you can't help but marvel at how the trade routes of the past laid the groundwork for our globalized world. As you reflect on the 21st century version of the Silk Roads, you can't help but be struck by the role of Asia in this new era. The ancient Silk Roads, which connected the East to the West, have given rise to a new economic order, with China, India, and other Asian powers at the center. China's Belt and Road Initiative, which aims to create a network of trade routes across Asia, Africa, and Europe, is perhaps the most ambitious project of its kind in modern history. It's a direct reflection of the ancient Silk Road spirit of connecting cultures and economies. However, as with all great initiatives, there are debates surrounding its geopolitical implications. The Belt and Road Initiative is a modern manifestation of the ancient Silk Roads, but it comes with its own set of complexities. Some see it as an opportunity for global growth and collaboration, while others argue that it's a strategic move by China to expand its influence and assert its dominance over neighboring regions. Scholars still debate the true motivations behind the Belt and Road Initiative. Is it a continuation of the spirit of mutual benefit that defined the ancient Silk Roads, or is it a new form of geopolitical maneuvering? You can't help but wonder how this modern project will be viewed in the future. Will it be remembered as a visionary effort that united the world, or as a tool of dominance by a single power?
Beyond geopolitics, the legacy of the Silk Roads continues to influence global trade and cultural exchange in subtle yet profound ways. You notice it in the way people are increasingly open to learning about foreign cultures, ideas, and traditions. The internet has allowed cultures from every corner of the world to interact in ways that would have been unimaginable just a few generations ago. You feel this firsthand as you explore the fusion of global cuisine, fashion, and art. Just as the Silk Roads once facilitated the exchange of goods and ideas, the modern world is shaped by the free flow of creativity and innovation across borders. But while the world is more connected than ever before, there are challenges. The complexities of global trade, economics, and politics are ever present. For all the good that comes with greater connectivity, there are also concerns about inequality, exploitation, and the erosion of local cultures. Historians still argue whether the Silk Roads, in their ancient and modern forms, have ultimately been beneficial to all the regions they connected, or whether they have perpetuated systems of exploitation and dominance. Just as the ancient routes brought wealth and opportunity to some, they also brought conflict and instability to others. It's a reminder that the Silk Roads were never simply a route for peaceful exchange. They were, and still are, a battleground for power and influence. The new Silk Roads, with their focus on global trade, infrastructure, and technology, also come with their own set of risks. The rush to modernize, build, and connect has often led to environmental degradation, political tension, and cultural clashes. The rapid pace of technological development has raised questions about how we balance progress with preservation, ensuring that the rich cultural diversity and heritage of the regions connected by the Silk Roads are respected and maintained. You can't help but feel a sense of responsibility, as a citizen of the modern world, to ensure that the legacy of the Silk Roads isn't merely about economic growth, but also about the preservation of human dignity and the celebration of cultural diversity. As you continue to follow the path of the modern Silk Roads, you begin to see that the story of these ancient trade routes isn't just about the past, it's about the present and the future. The Silk Roads are not dead. They are evolving and adapting to the needs of a globalized world. The exchanges that once took place along these routes have left an indelible mark on the cultures they connected. The cultures of the ancient world, those of Persia, China, India, and Rome, continue to shape the way we think, act, and live today. The ancient Silk Roads may have disappeared, but their spirit lives on in every cross-border trade deal, every cultural exchange, and every step we take toward a more connected world. Historians still argue whether the modern Silk Roads are a true continuation of the ancient routes, or if they are simply a product of modern political and economic forces. Regardless of the debates, it's clear that the Silk Roads have left a lasting legacy. From the goods that once passed along these routes to the ideas that crossed borders and transformed civilizations, the Silk Roads remain one of the most influential and enduring symbols of human connection in history. They were, and are, a testament to the power of exchange, the beauty of diversity, and the unbreakable bond that ties us all together. As the world continues to globalize, the impact of the ancient Silk Roads becomes ever clearer. The trade routes that spanned across Asia, Africa, and Europe didn't just move goods, they moved people, ideas, and culture, weaving a complex tapestry of human connection that continues to reverberate through modern society. In fact, as you look around today, the ancient Silk Roads seem more alive than ever, even if their routes have morphed into new forms. It's not just physical trade anymore. It's the exchange of ideas, technologies, and cultures that has transcended borders. One example that comes to mind is the modern role of the Silk Roads in the digital era.
Just as merchants once traveled these routes with goods like silk and spices, modern businesses now navigate a digital landscape that connects nations in a similar, if not more intense way. The backbone of modern trade is often no longer the horse and cart, but the fiber optic cables that snake under the ocean, linking the continents together in an invisible web of communication. The rapid rise of e-commerce platforms, international banking, and online education are all examples of how the spirit of the Silk Roads lives on, albeit in a vastly different form. You can feel the power of these connections, even if the people facilitating the exchange are no longer visible.
Looking back, historians still argue over the true impact of the Silk Roads on the development of human civilization. Did they help cultures grow and flourish? Or did they sow the seeds of empire and exploitation? On one hand, the Silk Roads brought economic prosperity and cultural exchange. Ideas about science, art, and philosophy were shared and transformed. But on the other hand, the routes were not without their darker side. They also enabled empires to expand their influence and control, often through force. As you reflect on this, it becomes apparent that the Silk Roads were both a path to enlightenment and a battlefield for dominance. This duality is evident when considering how the legacy of the Silk Roads manifests itself in the modern world. Trade routes are no longer confined to land and sea. With the advent of globalization, goods and services flow through digital platforms just as easily as they once moved through caravans and ships. You can order a product from halfway around the world in mere hours, thanks to the invisible digital pathways that now mirror the ancient routes in their global reach. It's a profound transformation, and yet, in many ways, it's still the same exchange of goods, services, and ideas that defined the ancient world. The Silk Roads were more than just a physical trade route. They were a conduit for the spread of knowledge and culture. From the spread of Buddhism along the Silk Road to the transmission of paper-making technology from China to the West, the routes facilitated the cross-pollination of ideas that would change the course of history. It's the kind of cultural exchange that is continued in the digital age. One example being how the internet has made it possible for people across the world to share knowledge, art, and creativity. As you scroll through your phone, you might be receiving a message from someone in a far-off country, just as traders of old might have passed along goods that crossed continents. The technology might have changed, but the essence of human connection remains remarkably similar. Some historians argue that the Silk Roads were instrumental in shaping the global economy. They believe that the spread of trade goods like silk, spices, and precious metals laid the foundation for the complex global markets we navigate today. The ancient roads were the arteries through which wealth, power, and culture circulated. And in many ways, today's financial markets are still fueled by that same flow of global commerce. But there is also the argument that the Silk Roads helped create a global system of exploitation, where wealth flowed disproportionately to those at the top, leaving the majority of people along the routes impoverished. Whether for good or ill, the Silk Roads were the precursor to the modern world's economic and political systems, and their effects are still felt today. One thing is certain: the Silk Roads were a catalyst for change. They introduced new ideas, new technologies, and new ways of thinking to the world. And while much has changed since the days of the ancient trade routes, there's still a sense that we are following in their footsteps. We may no longer rely on camels to transport silk or spices, but we are still forging connections across continents, exchanging ideas and goods that shape our lives. It's a testament to the enduring power of human connection and the fundamental desire to trade and exchange. As the 21st century unfolds, the global economy continues to grow, fueled by the same principles that made the ancient Silk Roads so successful. The digital Silk Roads, which operate at the speed of light, have brought the world even closer together, opening new opportunities for collaboration, trade, and understanding. However, the challenges remain. How do we ensure that this new digital Silk Road is inclusive and equitable? How do we navigate the complexities of a global economy that, while more interconnected than ever, still faces issues of inequality, environmental sustainability, and political tension? As you think about this, you realize that the history of the Silk Roads is not just about the past. It's about the present and the future. The Silk Roads were not just a historical anomaly. They were a blueprint for how human beings interact with one another on a global scale. And the story of their legacy is still being written today. Whether in the physical world of trade or the virtual world of the internet, the Silk Roads continue to shape the way we live, work, and connect. And as you ponder this, it becomes clear that the future of the Silk Roads is one of continued transformation, as new technologies and ideas emerge to carry forward the ancient legacy of exchange, collaboration, and interconnectedness. As we arrive at the final stretch of our journey, reflecting on the centuries of cultural exchange, trade, and transformation that define the legacy of the Silk Roads, you start to understand just how far-reaching the effects of these ancient trade routes were. From the markets of Chang'an to the bustling streets of Constantinople, the Silk Roads were not just a series of trade routes. They were pathways for the flow of culture, philosophy, and technology. They connected civilizations, allowed for the exchange of goods, and helped shape the very structure of the ancient world. At its height, the Silk Roads were a network of land and sea routes that spanned from the heart of China, across the deserts of Central Asia, to the Mediterranean, and even into Africa. It was not just one road, but a complex web of trade routes that facilitated the exchange of silk, spices, precious metals, and so much more. The movement of these goods was just one part of the story. The true power of the Silk Roads lay in the human connections they fostered. One of the most significant impacts of the Silk Roads was the spread of religious and philosophical ideas. Buddhism, for example, traveled from India to China, Korea, and Japan, profoundly shaping the culture and societies of East Asia. Islam, too, spread along the trade routes, reaching Central Asia, India, and eventually sub-Saharan Africa. The exchange of religious ideas along the Silk Roads was not just about spreading faith. It was about the blending and adaptation of beliefs as they traveled across borders, influencing the cultures they encountered. The exchange of knowledge was just as powerful. The Silk Roads facilitated the transmission of science, technology, and art across the continents. The Chinese invention of papermaking traveled to the West, revolutionizing the way people recorded information. The knowledge of astronomy, medicine, and mathematics passed between the East and the West, laying the groundwork for later scientific advancements in the medieval and Renaissance periods. It is said that without the Silk Roads, the European Renaissance would have looked very different, deprived of the Eastern knowledge that fueled its rebirth. Historians still debate the extent to which the Silk Roads fostered the rise and fall of empires. Some argue that the routes were essential in the development of the great empires of the ancient and medieval worlds, including the Roman Empire, the Byzantine Empire, and the Mongol Empire. Others argue that the power dynamics between East and West were more complex, and that the Silk Roads merely served as a vehicle for the empire's rise, rather than being the catalyst itself. Nevertheless, what's undeniable is that the Silk Roads played a significant role in shaping the political and economic landscape of Eurasia. As the years went on, however, the routes began to decline. The Mongol Empire, which had once revitalized the Silk Roads through the Pax Mongolica, eventually fragmented, and new routes emerged that bypassed the traditional paths. The rise of maritime trade routes, particularly those controlled by European powers in the 15th and 16th centuries, shifted the focus away from the overland Silk Roads. But even as the Silk Roads fell into disuse, their legacy continued to influence the world in ways that are still evident today. One of the most powerful aspects of the Silk Roads' legacy is the way they shaped the global economy. The movement of goods and resources along the routes created early forms of global trade, linking distant parts of the world in ways that had never been possible before. The trade of goods like silk, spices, and precious metals created a system of interdependence that would form the basis of the modern global economy. Even though the trade routes may no longer be active in the same form, the principles of global trade that they established remain a key part of the way the world operates today. The world today is more interconnected than ever before. The digital age has created new Silk Roads, where information, culture,
and ideas move faster than ever, crossing borders at the speed of light. The rapid exchange of goods and services in the modern world is a direct descendant of the ancient Silk Roads. But even more than that, the ideals of cultural exchange, collaboration, and global cooperation that were fostered by the Silk Roads continue to shape how we interact with one another in the 21st century.
The legacy of the Silk Roads is not just about the exchange of goods, but the exchange of human experience. It's about the way that people from different cultures, regions, and backgrounds met, interacted, and influenced one another. The connections made along the Silk Roads helped create the interconnected world we live in today. From the cuisines we enjoy to the languages we speak, the Silk Roads left an indelible mark on the fabric of global culture.
Now, as you reflect on the history of these ancient trade routes, you realize how far the impact of the Silk Road stretches. From the deserts of Central Asia to the bustling ports of Europe, the influence of the Silk Roads has shaped our modern world in ways both big and small. It's a reminder that history is not just a series of events, but a continuous thread that connects us all, stretching from the past into the present, and even the future.
So, as the last chapter of the Silk Roads is written, you're reminded that their legacy is not confined to the past. It's a living, breathing part of the world today. The Silk Roads may have disappeared as a physical entity, but the spirit of the exchange they fostered is very much alive, shaping how we live, work, and connect with one another.